The envelope was white, standard business size. It had been placed in his mailbox with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested whoever put it there wanted him to know it hadn't been dropped. It had been delivered. Positioned. James Morrison stood at the end of his driveway in the early Nevada morning, the high desert air still carrying the cold edge of night, and turned the envelope over in his hands. The return address read, Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, Office of Compliance. He had lived on this property for 18 years. He had never received a letter from the Office of Compliance before, because until 4 months ago, there had been no Office of Compliance. There had only been the HOA board, a rotating cast of well-meaning retirees who organized the annual 4th of July potluck and argued about whether the approved palette for exterior paint should include a third shade of beige. He opened it at the kitchen table, coffee going cold beside him, and read it twice. Then he set it down and looked out the window at the ridge behind his house, where the pump housing sat behind its cedar fence, painted to match the exterior of his home. Maintained with the same quiet attention he gave everything on this property. The letter informed him that following a routine compliance inspection conducted on the 14th of the month, his property had been found in violation of HOA Covenant Section 4.2.1, which required all properties within Meadowbrook Estates to utilize approved community infrastructure for water service. His well, the letter explained, constituted a non-compliant private water system. He had 30 days to connect to the municipal water line or face a fine of $500 per month. James Morrison was a civil engineer. He had spent 30 years designing water distribution systems for municipalities across the American West. He understood, at a molecular level, how water moved through the earth, how it was captured, how it was rights protected, and how it was legally designated. He was not a man given to panic. He was a man given to documentation. He went to his filing cabinet, the old 4-drawer steel one in the corner of his home office that his wife had tried to replace with something modern and matching for 15 years. And he pulled the folder he had not opened in a long time because he had never needed to. The folder was thick. It contained the original water rights deed issued by the state of Nevada in 1989, 8 years before Meadowbrook Estates existed as anything other than a developer's rendering on a conference room wall. It contained the county infrastructure report from 1997, the year the development was incorporated, which listed his well designation NV-CR-0041, as the primary water source for the development's northern 40 homes. It contained the Critical Community Resource designation issued by the County Water Authority, a classification that carried specific legal weight under Nevada Administrative Code. It contained his annual water quality certifications, every one of them, going back to 1991, each one signed by a licensed hydrologist, each one showing water that met or exceeded federal drinking water standards. And he put the folder on the kitchen table next to the letter and looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called the number on the letterhead. The woman who answered introduced herself as Diane Chen, compliance officer. Her voice had the particular quality of someone who had decided, before the conversation began, how it was going to end. She was efficient. She was courteous in the way that a form letter is courteous, technically warm, functionally cold. James explained his situation clearly and without emotion. He told her the well predated the HOA by 8 years. He told her it was registered with the county as a critical community resource. He told her that 40 homes in Meadowbrook Estates received their water from his well, that this was documented in county records, and that the HOA's own infrastructure had been built around this fact. There was a pause on the line. Not a long one. Mr. Morrison, Diane Chen said, I appreciate you sharing that background, but the covenants are clear. Section 4.2.1 applies to all properties within the community. The history of how the infrastructure developed doesn't change what the covenants require today. You need to connect to municipal water service, or the fines will stand. You understand, James said carefully, worried that if I disconnect this well, 40 homes lose their water source. That's not really within the scope of my review, she said. My responsibility is covenant compliance. I'd encourage you to speak with the board if you have broader concerns. He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Outside, the morning had warmed enough that the light was coming in at a low angle across the ridge, and he could see the pump housing clearly, the cedar fence around it, the slight shimmer of heat already rising from the desert floor below. Beneath that ridge, beneath the caliche and the volcanic rock, the aquifer that had been there for 10,000 years was doing what it had always done, moving, filling. Rising through the casing he had drilled in 1989, when this land was just land and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and no one had yet imagined that a developer named Hargrove would buy up the surrounding parcels and build $400,000 homes on 2-acre lots and call it a community. James had bought this property because of the water. He had known what was down there. He had tested it, documented it, filed the rights paperwork with the state, and built his home on the highest point of the ridge specifically because he understood what that elevation meant for pressure and distribution. When Hargrove Development had come to him in 1996 with a proposal, they would build the infrastructure, he would provide the water rights access, and the arrangement would be codified in the county records. James had agreed because it was practical and because the alternative was watching 40 homes go in with no reliable water source. The arrangement was not informal. It was not a handshake. It was documented in county records and in the original development agreement, a copy of which was also in his filing cabinet. None of this, apparently, had made it into Diane Chen's compliance binder. He attended the next HOA board meeting. He brought the folder. He sat in the third row of the Meadowbrook Estates community room, which smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee, and he waited while the board worked through agenda items about the entrance landscaping and the proposed speed bump on Crestview Lane. When public comment opened, he walked to the front and laid his documentation on the table and explained, again calmly and specifically, what the well was, what it supplied, and why the violation notice was not legally supportable. Diane Chen sat at the end of the board table with a yellow legal pad and a pen and wrote things down while he spoke. She did not look up. Brad Kellerman, the HOA's legal counsel, sat beside her. He was a thin man with the kind of careful stillness that lawyers develop when they are deciding how much to reveal. He let James finish, for then he said that the board would take the information under advisement and that the compliance process would continue in the meantime. James looked at the board members. Most of them were looking at their own papers. One woman, Susan Wright, he would learn her name later, was looking at him with an expression that was not hostile. It was something closer to troubled. But she didn't speak. He drove home in the dark. The development was quiet around him, the houses lit from inside, the streets empty. He turned up his driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going in. From where he sat, he could see the pump housing on the ridge, the small red indicator light on the control panel glowing steady in the dark. It had been glowing steady for 18 years. Every house below him, the Garcias on Sycamore, the Pattersons on Crestview, with the young couple on Mesa View with the new baby. Every one of them had water tonight, because that light was on. He thought about what Diane Chen had said, that the history of how the infrastructure developed didn't change what the covenants required. He thought about his water rights deed, issued by the state of Nevada in 1989. He thought about the word rights, not privileges, not arrangements, not agreements subject to review by a compliance officer with a yellow legal pad. Rights, documented, filed, legally designated, and older than every covenant Meadowbrook Estates had ever written. He went inside. He put the folder back in the filing cabinet. He did not yet know what the next 18 months would cost him. In money, in sleep, in the particular exhaustion of being right in a system that has decided, for its own reasons, not to care. He did not yet know about the newsletter or the letters to his neighbors, or his daughter coming home from school with a look on her face that she wouldn't explain. But he knew one thing with the certainty of a man who had spent 30 years understanding how water moves through the earth. It always finds its level. The second notice arrived on a Tuesday. James knew it was coming. He had watched the calendar the way a man watches storm clouds building on a flat horizon, not with surprise, not with panic, but with the particular weariness of someone who has already calculated the wind speed and knows the rain is inevitable. 30 days had passed since Diane Chen's first notice of violation. He had not connected to municipal water. He had not paid the fine. He had not, in any formal sense, responded at all, because his attorney, a general practice lawyer named Feldman, who handled mostly real estate closings and the occasional DUI, had advised him to wait. "Don't engage yet," Feldman had said. "Let's see what they actually do." What they actually did was double it. The envelope was HOA standard. Cream-colored, the Meadowbrook Estate seal embossed in the upper left corner, like a coat of arms for a kingdom that had existed for exactly 22 years and controlled exactly 340 acres of former high desert scrubland. Inside, on letterhead that now included the name Kellerman and Associates, Attorneys at Law in bold type beneath the HOA logo, was a single-page document informing James that his fine had been escalated to $1,000 per month, effective immediately, and that continued non-compliance would result in a formal lien proceeding against his property. He read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he set it down and poured himself a second cup of coffee and looked out the window at the well housing, a modest concrete structure, painted the same beige as his house, surrounded by a low decorative fence he had installed years ago to keep the neighborhood aesthetically consistent. It looked like nothing. It looked like a utility box, like a transformer shed, like the kind of infrastructure people drive past every day without registering. It did not look like the thing keeping 40 families' toilets flushing, and their dishwashers running, and their children hydrated. He thought about that for a moment. Then he called Feldman. "They've retained outside counsel," Feldman said, and after James read him the letterhead. There was a pause on the line that James did not like. "Kellerman, Brad Kellerman. He does a lot of HOA work in the valley. He's aggressive." "How aggressive?" "He put a lien on a retired schoolteacher's house in Henderson because she painted her shutters the wrong shade of beige. Took 18 months to resolve." James said nothing. "James, I have to be honest with you. If this goes to litigation, we're looking at costs that could... HOA cases are expensive. They have the association's dues funding their legal fees. You'd be paying out of pocket." "I know," James said. "I'm not sure I'm the right attorney for this. My background is..." I know," James said again. "I'll figure it out." He hung up and sat for a long time in the quiet of his kitchen. The house was empty. His daughter, Maya, was at school. His ex-wife had taken her own counsel and her own life to Reno 4 years ago, and the house had been his alone since then. His and the wells, he sometimes thought, in the dark humor of a man who had learned to find company in responsibility. He had maintained that well for 18 years. He had paid for its pump replacements, its pressure tank upgrades, its annual water quality testing that consistently showed results cleaner than the municipal supply the HOA now wanted him to connect to. He had done this not because he was required to, but because 40 homes depended on it, and he was the kind of man who understood what dependency meant. The HOA did not know that, or rather, and this was the part that had begun to keep him awake, they knew it abstractly. The way people know that electricity comes from somewhere, that water comes from somewhere, that the infrastructure of daily life has a source. They knew it the way Diane Chen knew it when she had stood in his driveway 3 weeks ago, clipboard in hand, and he had explained it to her plainly. They knew it and had decided it was not their problem. That decision, James was beginning to understand, was going to become very much their problem, but not yet. Not in the way he was thinking about it, not as a weapon. He was not there yet, and he was not sure he wanted to be. What he did instead was go to the county recorder's office. He had his documents at home, the water rights deed, the 1997 infrastructure report, the well registration, but he wanted the originals. He wanted to hold the actual paper that the county had produced before Meadowbrook Estates had a name, before the HOA existed, before Brad Kellerman had a letterhead. He drove the 40 minutes to the county seat on a Wednesday morning and spent 2 hours in a fluorescent-lit room with a clerk named Patricia, who had worked there for 31 years and treated the archive with the reverence of a librarian and the efficiency of a surgeon. What he found confirmed everything he already knew and added one detail he had half forgotten. His well was not merely registered, it was designated. In the county's 1997 infrastructure assessment, conducted as part of the approval process for the Meadowbrook Estates development plan, the well on his property had been formally classified as a critical community resource, a designation used by Nevada's Division of Water Resources for private water sources that serve more than 10 residential units. The designation came with specific legal protections. It also came with specific legal obligations that ran in both directions. James was required to maintain the well in operational condition, and any entity seeking to compel its disconnection was required to obtain county approval, which required demonstrating an alternative water source capable of serving all dependent properties. He sat with that document for a long time. The HOA had never applied for county approval. The HOA had never, as far as he could determine, contacted the Division of Water Resources at all. Diane Chen had issued a notice of violation and doubled a fine and retained an aggressive attorney. And at no point in that process had anyone apparently asked the question that Patricia, the county clerk, could have answered in 45 seconds. What exactly is this well, and what happens if it stops running? He made copies of everything. He paid the copying fee, $4.20, and drove home. That evening, the HOA newsletter arrived in his mailbox. It was a 4-page document, printed on cream paper, with a cheerful masthead featuring a stylized rendering of the Meadowbrook Estates entrance gate. He had received it every month for 18 years. He had mostly ignored it. This month, on page 3, under a section titled Compliance Updates, his address appeared in print for the first time. It did not use his name, and it referred to once a property on Ridgeline Drive that remained Wishows in violation of community infrastructure standards, despite formal notice. It expressed the board's assured commitment to maintaining consistent standards that protect property values for all residents. It noted that MEM's unregulated private water systems present liability concerns that the board takes seriously. He read the paragraph 3 times. Then he read it a 4th time, slowly, the way he read engineering specifications, looking for the load-bearing elements, the places where the structure was weakest. Unregulated, that word. His well was tested quarterly by a state-certified laboratory. The results were filed with the county. The water quality records were public documents. His well was, by any reasonable measure, and among the most regulated water sources in the county, more carefully monitored than the municipal system the HOA wanted him to connect to, which had issued 2 boil water advisories in the past decade. Unregulated was not a description. It was a strategy. He understood then what Diane Chen was doing, what Kellerman was helping her do. They were building a narrative, not for the courts, not yet, for the neighbors. They were constructing a version of James Morrison in which he was not a civil engineer who had maintained a critical water resource for 18 years at his own expense. They were constructing a version in which he was a rogue operator, a holdout, a man whose stubbornness was endangering the community. They were doing this because they understood at some level that the legal ground was uncertain, that a man with a water rights deed and a county designation and 18 years of clean test results was not an easy target in a courtroom. So they were making him a social target instead. His daughter came home from school that Friday and went straight to her room. She did not come down for dinner. When he knocked and asked if she was all right, she said she was fine in the tone that means the opposite, and he stood in the hallway for a moment before going back downstairs. He did not ask her what had happened at school. He was afraid he already knew. He sat at his kitchen table with his copies from the county recorder's office spread in front of him, and he thought about Feldman's voice on the phone, that pause, that careful professional retreat, and he thought about the newsletter and the word unregulated and his daughter's closed door, and he felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. He thought about the well. He thought about 40 homes. He thought about the fact that the HOA had built an entire enforcement apparatus, fines, attorneys, newsletters, social pressure, on a foundation that no one had bothered to examine. They had looked at his property and seen a violation. They had not looked beneath it and seen what was keeping their community alive. He gathered his documents into a folder. He labeled it carefully, the way an engineer labels things, precisely, without drama. He put it in the fireproof cabinet in his home office, but next to his daughter's birth certificate and his property deed and the original water rights conveyance from 1989, signed by the county watermaster in ink that had faded to the color of old grass. He did not yet know what he was going to do with any of it. But he was beginning to understand that the HOA had made a very specific kind of mistake, the kind that compounds, the kind that gets worse the harder you push, the kind where the more certain you are that you are winning, the more completely you are setting yourself up to lose. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. The well ran quietly beneath his property, as it had for 34 years, indifferent to covenants and compliance officers and cream-colored envelopes, doing the only thing it had ever been asked to do. The newsletter arrived on a Tuesday. James found it in his mailbox between a utility bill and a coupon circular, folded in thirds, printed on the HOA's signature cream-colored paper with the Meadowbrook Estates crest embossed at the top, a little watercolor house surrounded by little watercolor trees, the kind of logo designed to communicate warmth and belonging. He stood at the end of his driveway and read his own name in the third paragraph. Not buried, not incidental. Centered in a sentence that had been crafted with the specific, practiced cruelty of institutional language, which is to say, it said nothing outright and implied everything. The board wishes to remind all residents that non-compliant infrastructure poses documented risks to community property values and the safety of shared resources. In ongoing compliance proceedings involving properties in the Ridgeline section of Meadowbrook Estates are being actively monitored. Ridgeline section. There were 4 homes in the Ridgeline section. Everyone would know which one. He folded the newsletter back along its original creases and carried it inside. He set it on the kitchen counter next to the stack of HOA correspondence he had stopped opening 3 weeks ago, the envelopes accumulating in a small, neat tower that his daughter Emma had started referring to as the monument. She said it without humor. She was 17, and she had stopped saying most things with humor since September, since the morning she came home from school and told him, quietly, in the way teenagers deliver news they have been carrying all day, in that Kayla Brennan had asked her whether her dad was the one causing problems for the whole neighborhood. He had not known what to say to her. He had started 3 different sentences and finished none of them. The HOA understood something that James, in his engineer's mind, had been slow to fully appreciate: that the most effective punishment is rarely the fine itself. The fine is the mechanism. The real instrument is the social architecture the fine constructs around a person. Diane Chen had not simply issued a violation notice. She had issued a story, and stories, once released into a community, propagate without the original author's involvement. They move through backyard fences and school pickup lines and the comment threads of the Meadowbrook Estates Facebook group, where a post from an account called Wamanu Concerned Neighbor had appeared 11 days ago asking, in the most reasonable possible tone, whether anyone else was worried about unregulated water sources in the community. 47 people had reacted to that post, 31 of them with the concerned face emoji. James had not commented. He had read it once, closed the app, and not returned to it. His neighbor to the south, Phil Garrity, had stopped waving when he pulled out of his driveway in the mornings. Phil had waved every morning for 11 years. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The Hendersons, 2 lots over, had declined his invitation to the fall cookout he hosted every October, the one he had hosted every October for a decade, with the one where he smoked brisket for 14 hours, and Linda Henderson always brought her cornbread, and they sat around the fire pit until the temperature dropped and someone's kid fell asleep in a lawn chair. Linda had texted him a brief, careful message. "So sorry, we have a thing that weekend. Hope it's great." The exclamation point doing the work of a door closing. He had cooked the brisket anyway. He and Emma ate it at the patio table in the October dark, and she told him about a book she was reading for English class, and he listened carefully because he understood that she was doing him a kindness. What the HOA could not know, what Diane Chen, in her compliance binder certainty, had never thought to investigate, was the physical reality beneath the social one. James walked his property every Sunday morning. It was a habit from the early years, when he was still learning the land, still understanding what he had purchased. He would start at the northeast corner, move along the fence line, and end at the well housing. A low concrete structure at the property's highest point, painted the same sage green as his fence, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it was. He would lift the access panel and check the pressure gauge. He would listen to the pump. He had been doing this for 18 years, and he knew the sound of that pump the way a person knows a familiar voice, its rhythm, its pitch, the particular quality of its labor. The well ran at a depth of 340 feet, drawing from an artesian aquifer that had been documented in the original 1997 County Infrastructure Survey as a primary source of exceptional yield and reliability. The survey was in his files. He had read it so many times he could recite sections from memory. The county had classified the well under a designation he had not fully understood when he first purchased the property: critical community resource. He had asked the previous owner about it during the walkthrough. The man, a retired hydrologist named Garrett, who had drilled the well himself in 1982, had explained it simply. "The well doesn't just serve your house," he said. "It serves the ground beneath all of this. When they built the development around it, they built it knowing the well was here. The infrastructure was designed around the well, not the other way around." James had nodded and signed the papers and moved in and spent 18 years thinking of the well as his responsibility, and not much more than that. He maintained it. He paid for its upkeep. He had never once considered it as leverage because he had never needed leverage. He had been, until September, a man who did not think in those terms. Now he stood at the access panel on a Sunday morning in November, pressure gauge reading steady, pump cycling with its familiar rhythm, and he did the arithmetic he had been avoiding. 40 homes. the development's municipal water connection, installed in 2003, handled grey water and irrigation. Drinking water, household water, the water that came out of 40 sets of taps and filled 40 water heaters and supplied 40 toilets. That water came from here, from this pump, from this aquifer, through pipes that ran downhill from this property in 4 directions like the spokes of a wheel. And James Morrison's land was the hub. The HOA had sent him 11 pieces of correspondence in 3 months. Not one of them had mentioned this. He thought about Diane Chen sitting in her compliance chair, her binder open to Section 4.2.1, her pen moving across her violation forms with the confidence of a person who believes that authority is a function of documentation. He thought about Brad Kellerman drafting his demand letters in whatever office Brad Kellerman occupied, billing hours against a situation he had not bothered to research at the county level. He thought about the board members who had voted to escalate his fines without asking a single question about what the well actually was or what it actually did. He replaced the access panel. And he stood in the November cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked out over the rooftops of Meadowbrook Estates spreading downhill from his property in every direction. The neat yards, the 2-car garages, the basketball hoops and trampoline nets and decorative mailboxes of a community that had decided, collectively, that he was the problem. 40 homes. He had not told anyone this number. He had not used it, had not referenced it in any of his brief, civil responses to the HOA's correspondence. He had simply stated that the well predated the HOA and that he held the water rights and that he believed the violation notice was issued in error. He had said this calmly and in writing, and they had responded by doubling his fine and publishing his name in a newsletter. He was not an angry man. He had never been an angry man. But standing on his property on that November morning, listening to the pump work its steady rhythm 40 feet below his feet, he felt something clarify inside him, the way a solution clarifies when the temperature drops. Everything suspended, becoming suddenly, visibly distinct. He had been trying to explain himself. He had been writing letters and attending meetings and presenting documentation to people who had already decided what he was. He had been operating as though the dispute was about information, as though Diane Chen simply didn't understand the situation and would, once she understood it, behave differently. She understood enough. She had chosen this anyway. Emma was inside making coffee. He could see her through the kitchen window, moving in that unhurried Saturday morning way she had, and he thought about the morning she had come home from school and told him about Kayla Brennan's question, and the 3 sentences he had started and not finished. He went inside. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from his daughter at the kitchen table and looked at the stack of unopened HOA envelopes on the counter. He needed someone who spoke a different language than he did, not the language of engineering or documentation or patient explanation. Someone who understood that some disputes are not resolved by being right. They are resolved by making the cost of being wrong undeniable. He just didn't know yet who that person was. Robert Torres had a habit of watching his neighbors from his kitchen window while he drank his morning coffee. Not in any suspicious way. More the way a man watches weather, reading small signs for what might be coming. He had spent 22 years as a water rights attorney in Nevada, and that kind of work teaches you to pay attention to things other people dismiss as background noise. The shape of a drainage ditch, the direction a pipe runs beneath a yard, the particular silence of a neighborhood that depends on infrastructure it doesn't fully understand. He had watched James Morrison's mailbox for 3 weeks. Not James himself. James had largely disappeared from the visible life of Meadowbrook Estates, retreating behind his front door the way a man retreats behind a wound. But the mailbox told the story clearly enough. The HOA's certified letters arrived with a regularity that Robert recognized immediately. He had seen that rhythm before, in corporate disputes and municipal water wars. and the slow institutional grinding of agencies that had learned to use paperwork as a weapon. One letter every 10 days, then every 7. The cadence of escalation. The cadence of an organization that believed time and volume were on its side. On a Tuesday morning in late October, he knocked on James's door. James answered, looking like a man who had been sleeping badly and eating worse. There were papers on the kitchen table behind him, stacked in the particular disorder of someone who has read the same documents so many times they've stopped being able to organize them. Robert recognized that too. The paralysis that sets in when a problem feels simultaneously urgent and unsolvable. "I'm not here about the neighborhood association," Robert said before James could speak. "I'm here as your neighbor. Can I come in?" They sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them, and James explained everything. He was methodical about it, the way engineers are. He laid out the timeline, the notices, the fines, the board meeting where Diane Chen had described his well as a liability to the community. He slid the original notice of violation across the table, then the demand letter from Brad Kellerman, then the HOA newsletter with his name printed under a heading that read Ongoing Compliance Issues. He did it without much visible emotion, which Robert understood was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of exhaustion. Robert listened without interrupting. He picked up each document, read it fully, set it down. When James finished, Robert was quiet for a long moment. What do you know about your water rights documentation?" he asked. James pulled a manila folder from beneath the stack. Inside was a deed. Not a property deed, but a water rights deed. The kind that gets recorded separately at the county assessor's office and that most people, including most attorneys, don't think to look for. It was dated 1991. 6 years before Meadowbrook Estates existed as anything other than undeveloped high desert. It named James's property as the registered point of diversion for an artesian well, and it listed the beneficial use designation as domestic and municipal supply. Robert held it under the kitchen light and read it twice. "Have you shown this to anyone?" he asked. "And I showed it to Diane Chen the day she issued the violation. She told me it wasn't relevant to HOA covenant compliance." Robert set the document down carefully, the way you set down something fragile or something important, and in this case it was both. "Chid James Hambul," he said, "I need you to understand something. Diane Chen is not a lawyer. Brad Kellerman may be a lawyer, but he's an HOA attorney, which means his entire professional framework is built around covenant enforcement. Neither of them has any reason to understand water rights law, and more importantly, neither of them has gone looking for what they don't know." He paused. "That is a significant problem for them." He asked for 3 weeks and access to whatever county records James could pull. James gave him both without hesitation, with the particular gratitude of a man who has been fighting alone long enough that the arrival of any ally feels like oxygen. What Robert found over those 3 weeks rearranged the entire geometry of the situation. He started at the county recorder's office, where he pulled the original infrastructure survey from 1997, the year Meadowbrook Estates was formally incorporated as a planned community. The survey was 47 pages long and written in the dense technical language of civil engineering assessments. On page 31, in a section titled Primary Water Supply Infrastructure, James's well was identified as the sole source of potable water for the development's initial 40 residential lots. It had been designated a critical community resource under Nevada Administrative Code 445A.860, in a designation that carried specific legal protections Robert knew well. He then pulled the HOA's own governing documents, the full covenants, conditions, and restrictions, not the summary version the board distributed to homeowners, but the original recorded document filed with the county in 1997. He read all 89 pages. On page 61, in a section titled Infrastructure and Utilities, he found Section 12.4, which read, "Infrastructure predating community incorporation and registered with the county at the time of HOA formation shall be exempt from modernization or compliance requirements imposed by subsequent board action." No one had cited that section in 20 years. Robert suspected no one on the current board had read past page 20. He saved the most important discovery for last. Nevada Revised Statutes. Section 116.31 governed HOA authority over homeowner property in planned communities. It was specific and it was unambiguous. An HOA could not impose fines or compliance requirements on a homeowner for the use of private water rights legally established prior to community incorporation. The statute had been amended in 2009 to close exactly the kind of loophole Diane Chen had walked through. Every fine she had issued was illegal under state law, not procedurally questionable, not subject to interpretation. Illegal. Robert sat in his home office on a Friday evening, with all of it spread across his desk, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent a career in a technical field and found a case where the technical field answers every question cleanly and completely. There was no ambiguity here. There was no grey area. The HOA had built an elaborate enforcement structure on a foundation that the law had already demolished before they poured the first concrete. But there was something else, something that went beyond the legal architecture and into the physical reality of Meadowbrook Estates. Robert had pulled the current county water service records, and they confirmed what the 1997 survey had established. 40 homes in this development received their water from James Morrison's well. The municipal water connection that the HOA's covenant referenced as the required community infrastructure had never been completed. The development had been built around James's well and had remained dependent on it for 18 years. The HOA had been fining a man for operating the only water source that kept their community alive. He called James that evening and asked him to come over. He laid it out piece by piece, the way he used to lay out cases for clients who needed to understand not just the conclusion, but the path that led there. James sat across from him and listened with the focused stillness of an engineer receiving a technical briefing. When Robert finished, the kitchen was quiet for a moment. "But they don't know any of this," James said. It wasn't a question. "Kellerman may suspect some of it," Robert said. "But I don't think he's done the research. I think he's been operating on the assumption that covenant language is sufficient authority and that you don't have the resources or the knowledge to challenge it." James looked at the documents spread between them. 18 months of fines. His daughter's name whispered in school hallways. His name in a newsletter. The particular loneliness of a man who had been made into a community problem for the crime of owning something the community needed. "So what do we do?" he asked. Robert had been a water rights attorney for 22 years. He had negotiated with municipalities and mining companies and federal agencies. He had learned that the most powerful legal instrument is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. Sometimes it is the one that simply, quietly, makes clear what is true. "We write them a letter," he said. "Just facts. We let the facts do what facts do." James nodded slowly. Outside, the Nevada night was cold and clear, and somewhere beneath the highest point of Meadowbrook Estates, water moved through ancient stone in the dark, patient and indifferent to the arguments of men, flowing exactly where it had always flowed, toward the 40 homes that had no idea how close they were standing to the edge of thirst. Robert Torres had a system for county records. He developed it over 22 years of water rights litigation, back when Nevada's aquifer disputes were settled in courthouse basements with paper maps and surveyor's tape, back before everything went digital and people forgot that digital records were only as complete as whoever had done the scanning. The system was simple. You never trusted the index. You went to the physical archive. You found the decade you needed, and you read everything, not the summaries, everything. He'd told James this on a Tuesday evening, standing in James's kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold on the counter between them. James had nodded and said he understood. Robert wasn't sure he did. Understanding the principle and understanding what it cost. 3 weeks of 8-hour days in a room that smelled like deteriorating paper and industrial cleaning fluid. Running your finger down columns of property descriptions written by county clerks who'd been paid by the word. Those were different things entirely. Robert paid the cost anyway. He paid it because he'd seen the look on James's face when he'd spread the documentation across the kitchen table. Not panic, not outrage, something quieter and more corrosive than either. The look of a man who had done everything correctly and was being punished for it with institutional precision, and who had begun, somewhere in the last several months, to wonder if doing everything correctly had been a mistake. Robert had seen that look before. He'd seen it on ranchers and farmers and small-scale developers who'd come to his office with their water rights documentation in manila folders, certain that the paperwork would speak for itself, certain that the law was a system that rewarded clarity. He'd spent 2 decades explaining to those people that the law rewarded preparation. There was a difference. He found the first critical document on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week. It was filed under a county infrastructure designation from 1997, in cross-reference to a property survey from 1982, and it had not been scanned into the digital system because the scanning project had run out of funding in 2011, and the county had never resumed it. The document was 11 pages long, single-spaced, typed on a machine that had a slightly elevated letter E throughout. It was titled Meadowbrook Basin Water Infrastructure Assessment and Critical Resource Designation, Washoe County Division of Water Resources. Robert read it twice before he allowed himself to feel anything. Then he sat back in his chair, in that room that smelled like old paper and cleaning fluid, and he permitted himself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Then he pulled out his legal pad and began taking notes. The assessment was comprehensive in the way that 1997 county documents sometimes were, before budget cuts had reduced infrastructure reporting to checkbox forms and GIS overlays. It documented the Meadowbrook Basin's groundwater geology in detail. It documented the artesian pressure that made the well viable without mechanical pumping. It documented the service radius. And on page 7, in language that was bureaucratic but unambiguous, it designated James Morrison's well, identified by its county registration number, its GPS coordinates, and its deed description, as a critical community resource under Nevada Administrative Code, Chapter 532. The designation carried specific legal weight. Robert knew this because he had argued the statute twice in district court and once before the Nevada Supreme Court, on behalf of clients who were trying to protect agricultural water sources from municipal annexation. A critical community resource designation meant the resource was formally recognized as essential infrastructure for a defined population. It meant the resource could not be altered, redirected, or decommissioned without county approval. It meant that any governing body, municipal, corporate, or private, that attempted to interfere with the resource's operation was subject to state-level regulatory review. The HOA was a private governing body. The HOA had been attempting to interfere with the resource's operation for 18 months. The HOA had done this without, as far as Robert could determine, any awareness that the designation existed. He found the second document on Thursday afternoon. This one had been scanned, but it had been misfiled under a neighboring parcel number, which was why James hadn't found it in his own research. It was the original water rights deed, recorded in 1979. 18 years before the Meadowbrook Estates development had been incorporated as a planned community, 23 years before the HOA had been established and its covenants written. The deed was registered to the property, not to any individual owner, which meant it transferred with the land. It meant James hadn't just purchased a house. He had purchased a water right that predated every structure in the surrounding development. Nevada water law operated on the prior appropriation doctrine. First in time, first in right. The principle was foundational, older than statehood, written into the legal architecture of the entire American West, because water in the desert was not a convenience, it was existence. The 1979 deed established James's well as the senior water right in the Meadowbrook Basin. Every other water claim in the development, every municipal connection, every irrigation permit, every HOA infrastructure covenant was junior to it. Robert understood, sitting in that archive room, that the HOA had not merely overreached. They had overreached against the most legally protected private water right in the basin. They had issued fines, threatened liens, and conducted a sustained campaign of institutional pressure against a man whose property rights were, in the specific technical language of Nevada water law, essentially unassailable. He found the third document on Friday morning, and this one made him set down his pen. It was the HOA's own incorporation documents from 2002, filed with the county as part of the planned community registration process. Standard material, articles of incorporation, the original covenant framework, the infrastructure schedule. Robert read the infrastructure schedule carefully, because infrastructure schedules in planned community documents were where the bodies were buried. They were where developers made the representations that later became either protections or liabilities, depending on which side of the dispute you were on. On page 14 of the infrastructure schedule, under a section heading that read, Existing Infrastructure and Predecessor Rights, was a clause. It was not buried exactly. It was formatted like every other clause in the document, in the same typeface, with the same indentation. But it had the quality of language that had been written by a careful attorney and then never read again by anyone. Section 12.4. Robert copied it word for word onto his legal pad. Infrastructure predating community incorporation, including but not limited to water sources, easements, drainage systems, and utility corridors, shall be exempt from modernization requirements and shall retain all rights and designations established prior to the date of incorporation. The HOA Board shall have no authority to compel modification, disconnection, or decommissioning of such infrastructure without the written consent of the infrastructure owner and applicable county or state regulatory bodies. Robert read it again. He read it a third time, slowly, the way he read language that was going to matter in a courtroom. But Section 12.4 had been written in 2002 by the developer's attorney, almost certainly to protect the developer from liability during the transition period when the community was being handed off to HOA governance. It had been written to ensure that if any pre-existing infrastructure caused problems, the HOA couldn't come back to the developer and claim they'd been forced to assume responsibility for it. It was protective language drafted for one purpose that happened to create an absolute legal shield for exactly the situation James was now in. Diane Chen had issued her notice of violation under Section 4.2.1 of the HOA Covenants. Section 4.2.1 required all properties to utilize approved community infrastructure. She had applied it to James's well without, apparently, reading Section 12.4, which exempted pre-existing infrastructure from exactly that requirement. The covenant she had used to find James was superseded, within the HOA's own governing documents, by a clause she had never consulted. Robert drove to James's house that evening. He didn't call ahead. He pulled into the driveway at 6:15. walked to the front door and knocked. James answered in work clothes, still carrying the particular exhaustion that had settled into him over the past several months. Not physical tiredness, but the deeper fatigue of sustained, unresolved injustice. Robert held up his legal pad. "I need your kitchen table." He said. They sat for 2 hours. Robert walked James through each document in sequence, laying the legal pad pages out in order. I'm explaining the significance of each finding in plain language before explaining it in technical language. He watched James's face as he did this. He watched the exhaustion shift into something else. Not excitement, not triumph, but a careful, controlled attention. The face of an engineer encountering a structural analysis that resolved a problem he'd thought was intractable. When Robert finished, James was quiet for a long moment. "They didn't know," James said finally. "It wasn't a question. Diane Chen didn't know," Robert said. "Brad Kellerman should have known. He's their legal counsel. He should have pulled the infrastructure schedule before he issued a single demand letter. He didn't, or he did and missed it, which is arguably worse." "And the fines," James said. "Illegal from the first one. Nevada Revised Statutes 116.31 prohibits HOA fines for the exercise of private water rights on private property. Every fine Diane Chen issued was issued without statutory authority. The $18,000 you've paid is recoverable." James looked at the legal pad pages spread across his table. Outside, the Nevada evening was going dark, and somewhere beneath the ground under his house, the artesian pressure that had been building in the Meadowbrook Basin since before any of these houses existed was doing what it had always done: moving, sustaining, indifferent to covenants and compliance binders and the institutional certainties of people who had never thought to ask where their water came from. "What do we do with this?" James asked. Robert gathered the pages into a neat stack. "We write them a letter," he said. "Not a threat, just facts." He paused. "The facts are enough." James nodded slowly. He looked at the stack of papers. 3 weeks of archive work, 11 pages of county assessment, a water rights deed from 1979, and 14 words in Section 12.4 that the HOA had written for themselves and never read. He looked at all of it, and for the first time in 18 months, the exhaustion in his face was gone. What replaced it was patience. The particular patience of a man who now understood exactly what he was holding and was in no hurry at all. Robert Torres did not write angry letters. He had spent 22 years in water rights litigation, watching angry letters get thrown out of court, watching judges roll their eyes at emotional language and theatrical accusations, watching good cases collapse under the weight of their own outrage. He had learned the hard way in a Carson City courtroom in 2003, representing a rancher who had every right on his side and lost anyway because his attorney let the grievance show, that the most devastating legal document was one that felt like a weather report. Calm, factual, inevitable. He sat at James Morrison's kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in late October, with a yellow legal pad, a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and 6 weeks of county records spread across every available surface. James sat across from him, not speaking. He had learned not to speak when Robert was working. The silence between them had become its own kind of language. The silence of a man who had finally stopped defending himself and started building something instead. Yet Robert wrote the opening line of the letter by hand before he typed anything. He always did this. He believed the hand knew things the keyboard didn't. He wrote, "This letter constitutes formal notice. Not a complaint, not a plea, a notice." The difference was everything. The letter that emerged over the next 3 hours was 4 pages long. It was addressed to the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors. Attention, Martin Hayes, Board President. It was copied And this was the part that made James go very still when Robert read it aloud. To the Washoe County Water Authority, the Nevada Division of Water Resources, and the Consumer Protection Division of the Nevada Attorney General's Office. Robert had not mentioned those last three recipients until the letter was finished. He had not mentioned them because he wanted James to hear the completed document first, to understand what it said, before he understood what it meant to say it in front of witnesses. "Read it again," James said. Robert read it again. The first section documented the well, not emotionally, not defensively. It simply stated facts in the order they occurred. The well had been drilled in 1987 by James's predecessor, a man named Gerald Whitfield, under Washoe County Well Permit, number 4471-B. The well had been registered with the Nevada Division of Water Resources in 1989 under Water Rights Certificate 87-204, designating it as a domestic and community supply source. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had been incorporated in 2002, 15 years after the well existed, 13 years after its water rights were certified, and under Nevada revised statutes. Chapter 533. Those rights were prior and paramount. They did not yield to subsequent private agreements. They did not yield to HOA covenants. They did not yield to compliance officers with binders. The second section addressed the fines. This was where Robert's language became, if anything, quieter. He did not call Diane Chen's actions malicious. He did not call them a power grab. He simply noted that Nevada revised statutes, Section 116.31031, prohibited a common interest community from imposing fines related to the use of private water rights on privately owned property. He noted the date of the first notice of violation. He noted the date of the first fine. He noted every subsequent fine, each amount, each cumulative total. He noted that the total collected from James Morrison over 18 months was $18,000. He noted that each of those fines had been imposed without legal authority. He used the word "bibasatnam void" 4 times. He used the word "idika" unlawful twice. He did not use the word "iya" outrageous once. The third section was about the county designation. This was the part James had not fully understood until Robert walked him through it the previous week. Sitting in the Washoe County Records Office with a photocopied infrastructure report from 1997 spread between them. The report, commissioned by the county during Meadowbrook's development approval process, had formally designated James's well as a critical community resource under County Infrastructure Code. That designation had never been rescinded. It had never been reviewed. It had simply sat in a filing cabinet for 27 years, while an HOA built itself around a water source it didn't know it depended on, and didn't know it couldn't touch. The designation meant something specific and consequential. The HOA could not compel disconnection, modification, or operational change to the well without written county approval. The county would not grant that approval. Robert had already made a quiet phone call to confirm this. The county water authority engineer he spoke with had laughed, not unkindly, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who had seen this kind of institutional blindness before. "They fined him for what?" the engineer had said, and then after a pause, "Send me a copy of whatever you send them." Robert had promised he would. The fourth section was the demand. It was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph demanded immediate cessation of all fines and the formal removal of all violations from James Morrison's HOA record within 30 days. The second paragraph demanded full reimbursement of the $18,000 collected, also within 30 days. The third paragraph was the one Robert read slowly, the one he had written and rewritten 6 times before he was satisfied with it. Should the HOA board wish to discuss resolution of this matter, Mr. Morrison remains available for that conversation and approaches it without hostility. Should the board instead choose to pursue litigation, Mr. Morrison will have no choice but to exercise all rights available to him under Nevada water law with respect to the operation, maintenance, and scheduling of his well, including any maintenance periods the well's condition may require. James looked up from the table when Robert finished reading. "That's it," he said. "That's the threat?" "That's not a threat," Robert said. "That's a fact. You have the right to take your well offline for maintenance. Every well owner does. 48 hours notice to affected parties, which in this case would be the county, not the HOA. Perfectly legal, perfectly routine. And if I did that, my 40 homes lose water pressure within 6 hours. Depending on storage tank levels, some of them lose water entirely within 12. Robert picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. "I'm not recommending you do it. I'm recommending you let them understand that you could." James was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Nevada high desert had gone dark and cold, and the only sound was the wind moving through the scrub brush on the hillside behind the house. The hillside under which, 200 feet down, water moved through limestone and sandstone in the dark, patient and indifferent to everything happening above it. "My daughter came home from school last week, James said finally. She didn't say anything. She just went to her room. I knocked on her door and she said she was fine. She's been saying she's fine for 6 months. Robert didn't respond to that directly. He had learned that some things didn't need a response. He capped his pen. "I'll have this formatted and ready to send by Thursday morning," he said. "Certified mail, return receipt, email copies to all recipients simultaneously. I want the board to receive it and know that the county and the AG's office received it at the same moment. I want there to be no version of events in which they can claim they were working on it quietly." James nodded. "One more thing," Robert said. He pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the stack, a county assessor's document unremarkable in appearance. The HOA's own bylaws, section 12.4. I found it in the original 2002 incorporation documents filed with the county. It's never been amended. He slid it across the table. James read it. It took him about 15 seconds. The clause stated, in the dry language of legal boilerplate, that no one had apparently read in 2 decades. Infrastructure predating community incorporation shall be exempt from modernization requirements and shall not be subject to compliance action without the written consent of the infrastructure owner. James set the paper down carefully, the way you set something down when you're afraid of what you might do if you hold it any longer. She didn't know, he said. Not forgiving Diane Chen, just naming the particular quality of what had happened to him, that it had been done by someone who had never bothered to learn what she was doing. No, Robert agreed. She didn't know. And Brad Kellerman should have. That's the part the Attorney General's office will find interesting. The letter went out Thursday morning, certified mail as promised, and the email copies landed in inboxes at 9:04 a.m. Robert had timed it deliberately, early enough that people would read it before the day consumed them, late enough that they couldn't make phone calls to each other before they'd had time to sit alone with what it said. James drove to work that morning the same way he always did, down the long road that curved past the development's entrance sign. Meadowbrook Estates, established 2002, in the kind of tasteful bronze lettering that cost more than some people's cars. He didn't look at it differently than he usually did. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt something quieter than that, something he didn't have an immediate word for. He thought about the well. He thought about it the way he sometimes did when he was driving. Not anxiously, but with a kind of structural awareness. The way an engineer thinks about load-bearing walls or bridge tolerances. It was down there right now, doing what it had always done, moving water through the dark at a rate of approximately 40 gallons per minute, supplying 40 homes with the thing they needed most and thought about least. It had been doing this since 1987. It had done it through droughts and board meetings and compliance audits and one very bad 18 months, during which a woman with a binder had decided it was a problem. It was not a problem. It was, in the specific language of Washoe County Infrastructure Code, a critical community resource. James Morrison had not chosen that designation. He had not applied for it or campaigned for it. He had simply bought a piece of land, inherited a well, paid his taxes, maintained his equipment, and minded his own business for 18 years. The designation had been there the whole time, sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting for someone to need it. By Thursday afternoon, Brad Kellerman had read the letter 3 times. By Thursday evening, Martin Hayes had called an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. By Friday morning, Diane Chen had not yet opened her compliance binder. The meeting was called for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, but people started arriving at 6:30. That was the first sign something had broken open inside Meadowbrook Estates. The fact that neighbors who hadn't attended a board meeting in 3 years were pulling into the community center parking lot while the sun was still above the tree line, finding seats, checking their phones, whispering to each other in the particular register that people use when they are frightened but haven't yet decided whether to admit it. By 6:55, every folding chair was occupied. People stood along the back wall. Someone had propped the side door open and a small cluster had gathered there too, half in, half out, as if they hadn't committed to being present for whatever was about to happen. James Morrison arrived at 7:02 and sat in the second to last row. He had dressed carefully, not formally. He wasn't there to perform authority. Dark slacks, a collared shirt, the kind of clothes a man wears when he wants to be taken seriously without appearing to try. Robert Torres sat beside him, a legal pad balanced on one knee, a pen uncapped in his hand. Robert had not told James what to say tonight. He had told him, "I'm very specifically what not to say. Don't threaten, don't raise your voice, don't explain more than you're asked. Let the silence do the work." Martin Hayes called the meeting to order from behind the folding table at the front of the room, and James watched him do it. Watched the way Martin's hand shook slightly as he reached for the microphone. Watched the way his eyes moved across the crowd and then away, like a man calculating odds and not liking what he found. Martin was 55 years old and had been board president for 4 years and had probably imagined his tenure as a series of landscaping disputes and parking variance requests. He had not imagined this. Diane Chen sat to Martin's left. Her compliance binder was on the table in front of her, closed. That was new. In every meeting James had attended before he stopped attending, the binder had been open, flagged, annotated. A prop she deployed like a weapon, flipping to the relevant section with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades making other people feel they had failed to read the fine print. Tonight the binder was closed, and her hands were folded on top of it, and she was looking at a point somewhere above the heads of the assembled homeowners, her expression calibrated to project composure and achieving something closer to vacancy. Brad Kellerman was not at the table. He was seated in a chair to the side, slightly apart, which James recognized as the posture of a lawyer who has advised his clients to say as little as possible and is positioning himself to intervene if they don't. Martin cleared his throat. He said that the board had called this special session to address concerns that had arisen regarding community infrastructure and to provide homeowners with accurate information. He said the word accurate with a particular emphasis, as if accuracy was something the board had recently discovered and was now committed to. He said there would be time for questions. A woman in the third row raised her hand before Martin had finished the sentence. Her name was Patricia Okafor, and she lived at 14 Sycamore Bend, and she had, James knew, 3 children and a mother-in-law living with her and a household that ran on the assumption that when she turned on the tap, water would come out. She said, "Egg, I want to know if my water is going to be shut off. I want a yes or a no." The room went very quiet, and Martin said that the board was working to resolve the situation and that no one's water service was in immediate jeopardy. Patricia said, "That's not a yes or a no." Someone near the back said, "Ewijasin, that's right," and someone else said, "Iwitsas, answer the questions." And Martin raised both hands in the gesture of a man trying to calm a room he no longer controls. This was the moment James had been waiting for. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular clarity of a person who has spent 18 months being told that reality is whatever the compliance binder says it is, and who is now watching reality assert itself in a room full of people who are only just beginning to understand what they've been living inside. Robert leaned slightly towards him and said nothing. He didn't need to. Martin said that the board had received a legal notice regarding the well on Mr. Morrison's property, and that the board's attorney was reviewing the matter. He said the board took all homeowner concerns seriously. He said the board was committed to transparency. A man named Gerald Fitch, who lived 4 houses down from James and had signed one of the letters suggesting James's property was a liability to the community, stood up without being recognized and said, "Is it true that the HOA has been fining him for operating the only water source we have?" The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. It had weight to it. It had the specific gravity of 40 households doing the arithmetic simultaneously. Diane Chen's hands tightened on top of the closed binder. Brad Kellerman shifted in his chair. Martin said that the situation was legally complex and that the board had acted in good faith based on the information available at the time. Gerald Fitch said, "What information? That the man owns the water we drink." James did not speak. Robert had told him not to speak yet, and Robert was right, because the room was doing something that no argument James could have made would have accomplished. The room was turning, not toward James exactly, toward the truth of the thing, toward the specific and clarifying recognition that the institution they had trusted to manage their community had spent 18 months punishing the man who kept their taps running, had fined him $23,000, had put his name in the newsletter, had sent letters to his neighbors designed to make him a pariah, and had done all of it without once checking whether they had the legal authority to do so, without once asking what would happen if he simply stopped. Susan Wright, the retired nurse who sat at the far end of the board table, looked at Diane Chen and asked a question that was quiet enough that James almost missed it. She said, "Did you know? When you issued the first notice, did you know what that well was?" Diane Chen said that she had followed the covenants as written. Susan said, "That's not what I asked." The room heard it. Every person in that room heard the difference between those two sentences, heard what lived in the space between them, heard the answer that Diane Chen had not given and would not give because there was no version of it that didn't indict her completely. Martin called for order. He said the board would be issuing a formal response to Mr. Morrison's legal notice within the week. He said the board was committed to reaching an equitable resolution. He used the word equitable with the careful enunciation of a man who has been coached to use it. Robert Torres wrote something on his legal pad and turned it so James could read it. It said, "They're going to settle." James looked at the front of the room. He looked at Diane Chen's closed binder and Brad Kellerman's careful stillness, and Martin Hayes' hands that had not stopped moving since the meeting began, adjusting the microphone, straightening papers, reaching for the water glass, doing anything except resting. He looked at the room full of his neighbors, some of whom had believed the newsletter, some of whom had stopped waving when they passed his driveway, and some of whom were only now understanding that the story they'd been told had been constructed specifically to make them complicit in something they never would have chosen. He thought about the well. He thought about the aquifer running deep and cold beneath his property, beneath the street, beneath all 40 houses, indifferent to covenants and compliance binders, and the institutional confidence of people who had never bothered to read the county records. He thought about the letter Robert had sent, and the single sentence near the end of it, and the fact that he had never once said he would shut the water off. He hadn't needed to. The meeting adjourned at 8:47. James drove home, made coffee, and waited for the phone to ring. It rang the next morning at 7:53. The morning James Morrison chose to shut down the well, he woke before sunrise. He didn't set an alarm. He simply opened his eyes at 4:47 in the morning, lay still for a moment in the dark, and knew that today was the day. Not because he was angry, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because Martin Hayes had called him the previous afternoon and said, in that particular tone men use when they believe they are still negotiating from a position of strength, that the board needed more time to review the documentation before committing to any reimbursement figure. More time. 18 months of fines. 18 months of violation notices. 18 months of his daughter's name whispered in school hallways because the HOA newsletter had printed his address next to the word non-compliant. And Martin Hayes needed more time. But James got up, dressed in the dark, and walked out to the equipment shed behind his house. The well control panel was a grey metal box mounted to the interior wall, about the size of a large medicine cabinet. James had installed it himself in 2003, after the original pump system needed replacing. He knew every switch, every gauge, every relay. He had maintained this system for 18 years, with the same quiet competence he brought to every engineering problem, methodically, without drama, because drama was expensive and precision was free. He stood in front of the panel for a long moment. The pressure gauge read nominal. The flow meter showed the steady, unremarkable rhythm of 40 households beginning their morning. Someone in the development was running a shower. Someone else was making coffee. But a sprinkler system on the south loop had just cycled on. He could see it in the slight dip and recovery of the pressure reading. 40 homes, 40 families, all of them dependent on a resource they had never thought about, never thanked, never even acknowledged existed. All of them, at this moment, in the care of a man their HOA had spent 18 months trying to destroy. James reached up and opened the panel cover. He did not shut off the main pump. He was not a cruel man, and he had no interest in causing suffering to people who had largely been bystanders to what Diane Chen had done to him. What he did instead was isolate the system to maintenance mode, a legitimate operational procedure that any licensed well operator was entitled to perform at any time, for any reason, without notice to any party, including a homeowners association that had no legal authority over his private infrastructure whatsoever. In maintenance mode, the well would continue to supply water at reduced pressure for approximately 4 hours. After that, the pressure would drop below the threshold needed to service the upper lots. Within 6 hours, the entire development would be running on whatever was left in the municipal backup line, a line that, Robert had confirmed, was sized for emergency use only and could not sustain 40 homes indefinitely. James had notified the County Water Authority the previous afternoon. He had filed the maintenance paperwork at 3:15, well within the required notice window. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything was, as Robert had said, with that particular grimness James had come to appreciate, airtight. He engaged the maintenance mode switch, noted the time in his logbook, 5:03 a.m., and walked back inside to make breakfast. He was on his second cup of coffee when his phone rang at 7:41. It was Martin Hayes. The voice on the other end was not the measured, stalling voice of the previous afternoon. It was something rawer than that. Something that had been standing in a kitchen, watching the faucet lose pressure and understanding, perhaps for the first time in the entire 18-month ordeal, that the man they had been fining and threatening and publicly humiliating was not a problem to be managed. He was the water. James. A pause. Well, the pressure is dropping. I know, James said. I'm performing scheduled maintenance on my well. I filed the paperwork with the county yesterday. Another pause. Longer this time. When will it be back online? That depends, James said, on how the maintenance goes. He heard Hayes exhale. It was the sound of a man doing arithmetic he did not want to do. James, I want you to know that the board met this morning and there's been a significant shift in our position regarding the fines. I'm glad to hear that, James said. Robert Torres is my point of contact on all HOA matters. You have his number, James, I need to be direct with you. People are going to start noticing the pressure drop within the hour. I have homeowners who are going to call me. I need to be able to tell them something. Tell them the well is undergoing maintenance, James said. That's accurate. And when will maintenance be complete? James looked out his kitchen window at the equipment shed, at the grey Nevada morning settling over the development that had been built around his property, around his well, around the water rights he had held for 18 years, while everyone pretended they didn't exist. And when the HOA board signs the resolution Robert sent over, he said, the one agreeing to full reimbursement of all fines, removal of all violations from my record, and a formal written acknowledgement that my well infrastructure is exempt from HOA covenants under Nevada law. When I have a signed copy in my hand, maintenance will be complete. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that James checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. And I'll call Robert, Hayes said finally. That's the right call, Martin, James said, and meant it without any particular satisfaction. Because the satisfaction was not in this phone call. It was not in the pressure gauge dropping, or in the sound of a man's certainty collapsing in real time. The satisfaction was something quieter and more durable than that. It was in the logbook on his kitchen table, in the county filing time-stamped 3:15 the previous afternoon, in the water rights deed that had sat in his fireproof safe for 18 years, patient and absolute, waiting for exactly this moment. It was in the fact that he had done nothing wrong, not once, not ever, and that the documentation proved it in language so clear that Brad Kellerman had reportedly gone pale reading it. Robert called him at 9:17. They signed, he said. All of it. Full reimbursement, violations expunged, written acknowledgement filed with the county. And Diane Chen submitted her resignation from the compliance officer position this morning, effective immediately. And Martin Hayes asked me very politely if you would please bring the well back online. James finished his coffee. He walked back out to the equipment shed in the thin morning light, opened the panel cover, and disengaged maintenance mode. The pressure gauge climbed steadily back to nominal. The flow meter resumed its quiet, unremarkable rhythm. Somewhere in the development, a shower ran. A coffee maker finished its cycle. A sprinkler system on the south loop prepared to run its morning sequence. 40 homes, still standing, still supplied, still dependent on a man who had never once threatened to abandon them, even when their own community had done everything in its power to make him feel like a stranger on his own land. Amy noted the time in his logbook, 9:22 a.m., and closed the panel cover. Then he walked back inside, sat down at his kitchen table, and called his daughter. It's over, he told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, and did we win? James looked out the window at the equipment shed, at the grey metal box inside it, at the invisible water moving through the ground beneath 40 homes that had never once asked where it came from. We were always going to win, he said. We just had to wait for them to figure that out.